I knew something was terribly wrong the moment Bradley started using words like synergy and paradigm shift in a meeting about the break room coffee supply. The kid had been at Apex Logistics Solutions for exactly 3 days, and he already acted like he founded the place. He came in on Monday, sat directly in my ergonomic chair Euro, the one I had custom ordered after 12 years on the operations floor Euro, cracked open an energy drink, and started lecturing the entire floor. If Steve Jobs wore cheap cologne and a fake gold watch, he would look exactly like Bradley. Bradley pointed at the whiteboard where I had spent the last 3 weeks mapping out supply chain contingencies for the third quarter. "We need to circle back on this bandwidth conversation offline," he said, using his hands to make a box shape in the air. What bandwidth? We were drowning in expired software licenses. Half our vendors were threatening breach of contract notices because of delayed payments, and someone almost certainly him was ghost editing access logs in the compliance portal. But I just smiled. That is exactly what you do when the vice president's 26-year-old son waddles into your department like he owns the entire building. You smile, you nod, and you let the rich boy play executive, hoping he will eventually get bored and wander off to write a LinkedIn article about hustle culture. Only Bradley did not wander off. He built a nest. He started showing up in meetings he was not invited to, rewriting task assignments that were already in progress, and reassigning the summer interns to fetch his dry cleaning. He even changed his email signature to Chief Operations Visionary and sent it out to external clients. I kept my head down. It is the unspoken rule of being a 48-year-old senior analyst. You do not rock the boat. You do not speak out of turn during strategic alignment meetings. And for the love of everything decent, you do not correct the vice president's son when he accidentally mislabels $4 million as miscellaneous office supplies in a procurement report. You just smile and silently fix it at 10 o'clock at night while eating stale vending machine pretzels and listening to your soul slowly evaporate. But lately, the vibe in the office had shifted dramatically. We were just weeks away from a full-blown compliance sweep. External auditors, legal observers, and even whispers of federal oversight were floating around if things did not look completely clean. Everyone was stressed and skittish. Human Resources was holding mandatory wellness town halls, which really meant passing out cheap stress balls and pretending like a free granola bar could undo the fact that our entire $75 million logistics software contract had just imploded over mysterious version control issues no one could trace. Version control, my foot. Someone was tampering with the back end. You could practically smell the panic in the air. That is exactly when Bradley showed up, fresh off a so-called strategy immersion week Euros, which was really just a vacation in Cabo San Lucas. He returned with a sudden, intense interest in the compliance portal. He walked up to me on a Tuesday morning, twirling a silver thumb drive around his finger, and asked, "What is the admin key for the Access research logs?" I blinked at him, completely deadpan, and said, "That is not something I can share with anyone outside of the audit team." He laughed, a casual, arrogant sound, like I had just told him his credit card was declined at a cheap diner. "Come on, Richard, we are all on the same team here." "Yeah, a team where only some of us actually go to jail for fraud." He started hovering around my desk. Late nights, weird hours. Twice I came in early and found the lights on in my office, which was highly unusual. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off, claiming he was just catching up on some backlog. What backlog? He did not even know where the main file server was located until last Thursday. But the real kicker came when he started copying people on emails Euros, people from legal, people from Recorza Euros, and pretending like he had independently discovered all the audit irregularities that I had personally flagged 3 months ago. He even used my exact phrasing in one email. High risk of exposure in tiered license segmentation. Word for word. My blood boiled so hot I could have fried an egg on my forehead. Still, I stayed perfectly silent. I have dealt with nepotism before in my 20 years in the industry. At least the other legacy hires knew when to shut up and let the real workers mop up their messes. But Bradley was too cocky, too twitchy. He acted like a guy who knew a massive storm was coming and was desperately scrambling to get ahead of it. Then, one morning, I noticed a thick red folder sitting slightly off-center in my bottom drawer. It was tucked halfway back, like it had been shoved in there in a massive hurry. And that is when I knew something incredibly ugly was about to hit the fan. It was 6:48 in the morning when I unlocked the door to my corner of the operations floor. My coffee was still too hot to drink. My inbox was already mocking me with 47 unread flags, and the only light in the office was the sickly blue glow from my desk monitor, which someone had left on overnight. I dropped my bag, booted up my terminal, and leaned back, half listening to the hum of the air conditioning, rattling like a ghost trapped in the vents. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, hesitant. It was Bradley. He was not supposed to be in yet. Half the time he showed up closer to noon, sunglasses still on, reeking of whatever downtown bar had hosted his networking event the night before. But there he was, creeping in dressed in wrinkled khakis and a quarter-zip sweater that probably cost more than my entire monthly rent. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he passed my cubicle, slowed down, and then backtracked. "Morning," he said, his voice way too cheery for someone who looked like he had barely survived a hangover 5 minutes ago. I nodded, offering a fake tight smile. "Bright and early." He laughed nervously and actively avoided making eye contact. Then he crouched down a Euros, just for a split second a Euros, right in front of my desk. My lower drawer clicked shut with a soft thunk. He popped up fast, acting like he had just dropped a pen, adjusted his shirt collar, mumbled something incoherent about client presentations, and then practically ran toward the break room. I did not move. I did not even blink. I just stared at that drawer like it had suddenly sprouted fangs. It was not locked. I never bothered locking it because of all the constant fire drills and the junk I kept in there. But now it felt completely radioactive. My stomach turned ice cold. That drawer had not been opened in days. The way his hand shook when he stood back up, that was not just nerves. That was pure, unfiltered guilt. I did not touch the drawer, not yet. Instead, I turned slowly to the dusty webcam perched on the top shelf of my bookshelf, perfectly camouflaged between two thick training binders and a sad-looking succulent plant. I had kept that camera running for months, ever since a sensitive thumb drive vanished from my desk and mysteriously showed up 2 weeks later in the lost and found, wiped completely clean. When no one owned up to it, Human Resources offered me a coupon for a trust-building lunch seminar. So, I set up my own surveillance, quiet, local storage only. No cloud uploads. I am not an idiot. I tapped my secure login, fast-forwarded through the static of the previous night, and froze the frame exactly at 6:43 in the morning. There he was, Bradley, letting himself in with a borrowed access badge, probably his father's. He beelined straight for my cubicle, his eyes darting back and forth like a nervous thief. He had a red folder tucked under his army Euros thick, glossy. Definitely not one of our standard office supplies. He opened my drawer, stuffed the folder inside, and slammed it shut. Then he did something that made my skin crawl. He took his phone out and snapped a quick selfie with my computer monitor clearly visible in the background. It was incredibly fast, barely a second long. But there was that smug little smirk on his face again. The exact same smirk he wore when he tried to explain the concept of a burn rate to our seasoned finance team. Bradley showed up late, as always. He waltzed in around 10:30, clutching an iced coffee in one hand and wearing a Bluetooth headset in the other, pretending to be on an incredibly important call. I watched him strut by, a walking balloon of puffed-up ego and coffee breath, and settle into the borrowed corner office he had somehow claimed as his personal operations zone. He immediately started doing what he always did when he felt nervous, talking way too loud. He paced the floor, bragging loudly to whoever was on the other end of the phone about landing a preliminary verbal agreement from a major partner in Atlanta. I knew for a fact that was complete garbage. Our Atlanta partner had ghosted us 3 weeks ago after Bradley accidentally sent a highly confidential contract draft to their biggest competitor. But the hallway did not need to know that. What the hallway did need to know was that Bradley left his expensive leather briefcase behind when he strutted out mid-call, heading for one of his endless client lunches that somehow always took place at the sushi restaurant his father's company expensed. And that briefcase was sitting unlocked, wide open on the guest chair beside his desk, looking like an engraved invitation. Then, just as calmly, I reached in my tote bag and pulled out the thick red folder, still slightly warm from my own hands. I had kept it sealed inside a plastic Ziploc bag, entirely untouched ever since I found it planted in my drawer the day before. I slipped the red folder into the briefcase. At first, I set it on top, but that looked too lazy. Instead, I wedged it carefully behind his laptop, leaving one edge partially sticking out, as if he had meant to grab it quickly but had forgotten in his rush to get to lunch. Natural, intentional, damning. By the time Bradley got back, smelling like overpriced sashimi and failed ambitions, I was elbows deep in software license reports. My eyes were glued to my screen, and I had my headphones in. He did not even notice the bag had been touched, but I certainly noticed him. I noticed the faint, rigid tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes darted toward my desk every few minutes, like he was waiting for a bomb to explode. Yes, that actually happened. On Monday afternoon, I had returned from lunch and found my desktop active, the mouse still warm to the touch. Bradley had borrowed it during a chaotic meeting scramble, left in a rush, and completely forgot to log out. I did not touch a single file. I just locked the screen and logged back in under my own credentials. But before the screen went dark, I saw it. That is when I realized this situation was much deeper than just petty office sabotage. Bradley was not just some entitled failure trying to flex his non-existent authority for his father. He was desperate, and desperation makes people do incredibly stupid things. He wanted to throw me under the bus for whatever massive disaster was about to hit the fan. It was almost certainly tied to that $75 million contract. Everyone in leadership had abruptly stopped mentioning, as if pretending it did not exist would magically make the legal risks disappear. Bradley was visibly unraveling. He completely stopped pretending to be the charming, visionary executive he so desperately wanted to project. Instead, he defaulted to snapping at anyone who dared to cross his path. At one point, I watched him yell at a junior data intern because the color scheme on a quarterly report did not align with his so-called stakeholder expectations. The kid was literally just formatting a standard spreadsheet. Bradley slammed the kid's computer mouse down on the desk and then awkwardly tried to play it off as a teaching moment. He did not speak to me at all, not a glance, not a grunt, not even one of his performative, self-important nods. He avoided my cubicle like it was surrounded by an invisible electric fence. In the mid-afternoon, I received a cryptic instant message from Helen. It just said, "Records room, 4:15. Helen had been at the company longer than anyone else on the operations floor. She knew exactly where every single digital and physical file lived, who had access to what, and exactly which document versions had been mysteriously revised after the official submission deadlines. She was the kind of veteran employee who could tell you what was missing from a 3-year-old financial audit just by glancing at the metadata. I grabbed a decoy folder full of useless quarterly projections, took the long route to the records department, and slipped in through the side entrance. Helen was waiting by the massive rolling shelves, casually sipping a terrible gas station coffee and looking at me with the sharp eyes of a woman who knew every single secret this company had ever buried. "You did not hear this from me," she said, without any preamble. "But someone has been aggressively backdating files in the main license archive." I blinked slowly, processing the information. "How recently?" "2 weeks ago," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door. "The database entries show as verified, but the internal server timestamps do not match the modification logs at all. It is incredibly sloppy work. Whoever did it actually thought the secondary metadata would not be audited by the external team." I did not respond verbally. I just raised an eyebrow. She took another sip of her coffee. "I highly suggest you check any shared server drives you have been added to recently, especially the ones you never specifically requested to view. And Bradley? Bradley had access. Not direct access, of course. He was far too junior for that. But his father had full executive override clearance, which meant Bradley was not just panicking over a minor screw-up. He was cornered, and he had used his father's credentials to execute a massive, illegal cover-up. Well, I sincerely hoped he enjoyed his false sense of security, because the compliance sweep was finally here. Sarah, our ruthless director of compliance, walked straight to the absolute center of the operations floor and announced the lockdown. All personnel are to remain at their current desks. Absolutely no exceptions, Sarah announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Desks will be thoroughly searched. Laptops will be immediately collected. Cell phones will be inspected only with probable cause. If you need to use the restroom, you must raise your hand and wait for an escort. No one leaves this floor until we are completely finished. You could hear the collective gasp of 50 terrified employees. I just nodded slowly and kept typing on my keyboard. My screen displayed a completely innocent, boring spreadsheet filled with third-quarter training hours. Bradley, however, turned the exact color of spoiled milk. He was standing 3 cubicles away, trying to crack a joke to an intern about the intense atmosphere, but his voice cracked. He immediately tried to bolt toward the break room, but a security officer blocked his path. They reached my desk in under 10 minutes. I looked up, offering a polite, calm smile. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "Please let me know if you need me to unlock any specific network drives." They simply nodded. No small talk. They opened my drawers. They were completely clean, holding nothing but standard office supplies. They checked my desktop files. Completely normal. They pulled my recent login history. Utterly boring. There was absolutely nothing planted, nothing touched, and nothing out of the ordinary. It was exactly what I wanted them to see. However, as one of the auditors opened my lowest desk drawer, the exact drawer Bradley had used the day before Euros, and found nothing but a heavy stapler and a lint-covered pack of chewing gum, I saw the briefest flicker of profound confusion cross her face. It was as if she had been specifically tipped off to expect something terrible right there in that exact spot. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. "Is there a problem?" I asked softly. "No," she replied, her voice completely flat. "Thank you for cooperating." As they moved on to the next row of cubicles, I caught a hushed whisper near the main compliance cluster in the center of the room. A mid-level manager, someone who worked closely with the legal department, leaned over and muttered to a colleague. "They found it in his briefcase," the manager whispered. "The red folder. Tagged documents, heavily tampered metadata." I did not react. I just kept typing absolute gibberish into a random spreadsheet cell. But inside my head, I was screaming with pure, unadulterated joy. Not just because Bradley was caught, but because it was that specific folder my folder that they had found securely stashed in his expensive leather briefcase. They did not even have to say his name. Everyone already knew. 10 minutes later, I watched Sarah call Bradley from across the massive room. He was sitting at his desk, pretending to scroll through his phone, nervously tapping the glass screen as if he expected a trap door to open up beneath his expensive shoes. "Bradley," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "Come with us right now." He stood up incredibly slowly, attempting to force a casual chuckle that sounded more like a dry cough. "Is this about the resource alignment project? Because I can explain a Euros?" "Now," Sarah interrupted, pointing toward the main glass conference room. He nodded like a man walking straight to the executioner's block and followed Sarah. The heavy glass door shut loudly, the internal blinds were immediately drawn closed, and Bradley, the self-declared chief operations visionary, did not emerge for an entire agonizing hour. When the door finally did open, it slammed against the wall like someone had kicked it. Bradley burst out of the conference room, his face a bright, splotchy red and sweating profusely. His expensive suit jacket was half hanging off his shoulder, and his collar was crumpled like he had been wrestling an invisible bear. His wide, unhinged eyes darted wildly around the room, hunting for someone to blame for his catastrophic failure. Then, his bloodshot eyes landed squarely on me. "You!" he barked, his voice so loud it made several interns physically jump in their seats. The entire operations floor turned to stare. Some people peeked cautiously over their cubicle walls. Others froze mid-step in the aisles. You could have dropped a paperclip and heard it echo. "You set me up!" Bradley screamed, storming toward my desk like a highly aggressive toddler throwing a temper tantrum. He aggressively wagged a trembling finger directly at my face. "You knew I had a client meeting. You planted that folder in my bag. You had access. You were digging around in the compliance tool just last week. This is corporate sabotage. You have been actively trying to get me fired since the very first day I walked in here. I calmly took off my reading glasses and swiveled my chair to face him, just as Sarah and two massive human resource representatives rounded the corner behind him like menacing shadows. Bradley did not even notice them approaching. He was far too busy completely unraveling in front of 50 witnesses. "You think you are so clever, do you?" he spat, leaning over my desk. "You think you are completely untouchable just because you have been working here for 20 years? You think my father is going to let you get away with this? Guess what, Richard? I have the real authority here. You are going to burn in federal court for this." I remained perfectly silent. My heartbeat was incredibly steady. My face showed absolutely zero emotion. I slowly reached into my top right desk drawer row, not the bottom one he had tried to use, and quietly retrieved a sealed manila envelope I had placed there early that morning. The seal was unbroken, labeled clearly with today's date, and tucked neatly under a yellow sticky note that simply read, "Insurance." I stood up slowly, matching his height, and calmly handed the envelope directly to Sarah, completely ignoring Bradley. "Evidence," I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried across the silent room. "For the official corporate record." Sarah took the envelope with a sharply raised eyebrow and passed it to the human resources representative, who opened it gingerly. Inside were two high-resolution printed photographs. The first photo clearly showed Bradley's open briefcase, with its contents spread out, his silver laptop, his obnoxious cologne, and a few scattered documents. The second photo, taken from the exact same angle with the exact same lighting, showed the briefcase with the damning red folder securely wedged behind the laptop. Both photos were clearly time-stamped, proving they were taken while Bradley was out of the office on his extended sushi lunch. The human resources representative did not say a single word. He simply showed the photos to Sarah, who exhaled sharply through her nose like a woman who was incredibly tired of dealing with entitled, rich idiots. Bradley took a slow step backward, the aggressive color completely draining from his face. "What is that?" he croaked. "That does not prove anything. You could have faked those photos. That is not a legal chain of custody." "You left your briefcase completely unattended in a public-facing office," Sarah stated flatly. "You previously claimed exclusive, unbroken possession of that bag. Now that claim is firmly in dispute." Bradley was cornered, flailing, and completely out of options. His grand frame job had just spectacularly detonated right in his own face. By 5:17 in the evening, the air inside the Apex Logistics Solutions building felt incredibly heavy. No one had left their desks in hours. Office phones were placed on silent, afternoon meetings were completely canceled, and the internal messaging system was completely dead. The only sound was the frantic typing of a few terrified analysts who were too scared to stop working, desperately hoping they would not be the next ones dragged into the massive compliance dragnet, and then the final ripple of terror hit the floor. It started with a frantic message from the lobby security guard in the company-wide chat. "He is here." There was absolutely no mistaking who he was. Stephen, the chief executive officer, company founder, and the undisputed godfather of this entire rickety corporate empire. Stephen had not visited our specific floor in over 6 months. He greatly preferred to rule from his massive executive suite downtown, rarely flying in unless someone had died or a massive legal disaster was about to destroy his stock options. A few brave employees stood up, cautiously peeking around corners. I stayed firmly seated. I knew exactly why he was here. Stephen did not say a single word to anyone on his way in. He just gave a sharp, terrifying nod to Sarah, a brief, cold pause to acknowledge the legal team, and then he disappeared straight into the main boardroom. He walked with the heavy, destructive force of a man who had entirely liquidated failing departments before he even finished his morning coffee. We waited in agonizing silence. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, at exactly 6 in the evening, the heavy boardroom door swung open. Stephen walked out. His expensive suit jacket was off, his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and he looked incredibly furious. It was not a loud, screaming kind of anger. It was much worse. It was a cold, measured, surgical kind of rage. Everyone on the floor completely froze. Stephen stood dead center in the middle of the room. his hands firmly clasped behind his back, scanning the terrified employees like a military general preparing to issue a mass execution order. Then, he spoke. Who was the last person to have physical eyes on the tampered compliance packet? It was a simple, quiet question, but it hit the room like an artillery shell. No one spoke. Not Sarah, not the legal team, not human resources, and certainly not Bradley, who had completely slinked back into a dark corner, desperately trying to blend into the drywall. I waited for 3 long heartbeats. Then I stood up. "He brought it," I said clearly, my voice completely steady, nodding directly toward the corner where Bradley was cowering, and I returned it to him. That was all I said. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, but the words snapped through the heavy air like a bullwhip. Stephen turned his head to look directly at me. His eyes were not angry. They were incredibly calculating, like he was cutting straight through bone to check for the source of a rotting infection. He nodded at me once, a gesture of cold respect, then turned back to Sarah. "I want the complete digital chain of custody logs, every single badge entry from the last 2 weeks, and full metadata comparisons on my desk tonight," Stephen commanded. "If there is even a single fraction of variation between his verbal testimony and the server records, flag it immediately." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied quickly. Stephen then turned his piercing gaze to the head of the legal department. "I want to know exactly how that highly restricted folder left the records room. Furthermore, I want a comprehensive list of every single employee who had edit access before and after the metadata was illegally modified." The legal team nodded furiously. Finally, Stephen's eyes landed on Bradley. He did not say a word. He did not yell. He did not even offer a tiny glance of paternal recognition for his vice president's son. He simply stared at the trembling 26-year-old for one long, devastating moment. Then, Stephen turned away and walked back into the boardroom, shutting the blinds tight. Bradley looked like he was going to vomit right there on the carpet. The climax happened at 6:49. There were no loud sirens, no dramatic shouting, just the heavy, deliberate tread of 2 armed security officers walking onto the operations floor, followed closely by a uniformed police officer with a shiny badge on his hip. They did not ask for directions. They knew exactly who they were here to arrest. Stephen had made one quiet, direct phone call from the boardroom, and now the heavy wheels of justice were grinding to a halt right around Bradley's expensive leather briefcase. The officers walked straight to Bradley's cubicle. When he saw them approaching, he stood up far too fast, nearly knocking over his chair. Wait! What is this? What is going on here?" Bradley stammered, trying to laugh, as if this was all some elaborate corporate prank. The lead officer did not smile. "Bradley, you are being officially detained under strong suspicion of corporate fraud, deliberate evidence tampering, and severe breaches of digital data integrity under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act Euro Title 18, United States Code, Section 1030. You will have a chance to speak with your legal counsel at the station. Please gather your personal items immediately." Bradley's face drained of every ounce of color. "This is completely insane," he snapped, his voice cracking violently. "You cannot detain me. This is entirely political. It is a massive witch hunt." He turned around, desperately scanning the room for allies. None came. Then his wild eyes locked onto me, and he practically lunged forward. "This is all her fault. I mean, his fault," Bradley screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Richard planted the folder. He has been illegally manipulating the server records." "He did not plant anything," Sarah cut in smoothly, stepping forward with the legal team. "We have the key card logs, the server access data, the hidden camera footage, and the corroborated timestamps. Mr. Bradley, we have cross-referenced every single version of the compliance file you touched. We have more than enough hard evidence." The police officer gently but firmly grabbed Bradley by the elbow. "This way, sir." Bradley tried to weakly pull free. "No, you are making a massive mistake. This is a setup. I know my federal rights." The officers did not argue. They simply marched him toward the elevators. Bradley's desperate voice echoed through the hallway, growing smaller and weaker with every single step. "He framed me. This is not over. Do you hear me?" The elevator doors slid closed, cutting him off completely. The silence that returned to the room was absolute. There was no cheering, no applause, just the heavy realization of what had just occurred. I stood slowly behind my desk, crossed my arms, and kept my expression completely blank. I was the incredibly still center in a room that had just spun itself into absolute chaos. I did not need to gloat. The hard truth was already screaming on my behalf. They called me into conference room A at 8:12 the next morning. Stephen, Sarah, and the head of legal were already sitting around the massive table. There was no human resources pamphlet, no termination paperwork or euros, just a cup of hot coffee in a thick envelope. "You handled this situation," Stephen said quietly, "better than most seasoned directors ever could have. We reviewed your footage and your access reporting," Sarah added with a tiny smirk. "You were incredibly surgical. You left him absolutely no room for interpretation." Stephen leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "We would like to officially offer you a new position. Senior Risk Analysis for the Internal Investigations Unit. Highly flexible schedule, a massive discretionary bonus structure, and full operational autonomy." It was an incredible offer. It was also exactly 6 weeks too late. I offered a polite, genuine smile, not the fake one I had used with Bradley. "Thank you for the incredibly generous offer," I said clearly, "but I have already accepted a different position at a private compliance consulting firm. Smaller office, but significantly better coffee." Stephen nodded once, a slow gesture of deep respect. "We will definitely miss you here, Richard." "I highly doubt that," I replied, standing up from the table. Back at my desk, I had already packed my single box. Nothing dramatic, just my essential items, my lucky pens, a framed photo of my golden retriever, and a small plant. I placed my worn company badge inside the box and closed the lid. There was no farewell party, no cheap balloons from human resources, just the satisfying knowledge that this building would never ever forget what happened here. I walked out with my back straight and my head held high. No lingering grudges, no dramatic speeches, just the absolute truth. I had not destroyed the vice president's son. I simply handed him the matches and let him burn his own career to the ground.